is the Director of Transportation at EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, and leads their transportation program, as well as the EVs to Scale 2030 initiative. And Britta is responsible for defining the market strategies needed to accelerate the electrification of the transportation system, with an urgent focus on identifying the critical gaps that need to be addressed to achieve 2030 climate-aligned goals. Prior to joining EPRI, Britta was the Director of Advanced Vehicle Commercialization at General Motors, responsible for the energy and infrastructure strategies required to enable commercialization of battery and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Britta is also currently the president of the Orlando Utilities Commission, which is Orlando's electric and water utility. And she's also a fantastic speaker and knows so much on this topic. So I'm really thrilled that we get to hear from her for the next 15 minutes. Britta, it's over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Hello, everybody. It's very good to be here with you today. Let me just dive right in. If we can just go to the next slide and maybe the one after. Let me explain what we're doing at EPRI right now. Yeah, that'll do just fine. We have an initiative called EVs to Scale 2030. It is an amazingly collaborative effort involving many, many stakeholders, including the Department of Energy and the NGOs, fleet operators, manufacturers, and so on. And why did it come about? Why do we need to do something specially here to pave the way to 2030 and electrification, widespread electrification of cars, buses, and trucks? What we knew about a year ago when the board said, hey, we've got to do something more in transportation. What are we supposed to be working? What do utilities need most? And it was pretty clear to folks that have been working with me for the last 20 years in this space that it's really about getting to scale. We don't have a lot of the tools, the processes to get to school. But what did we know on the left-hand side up here at the top? What we know is that in the 20 years I've been affiliated with electrification of transportation, I've never seen this much alignment. The federal government, the state governments, you've got fleet operators, the manufacturers of light-duty vehicles, as well as heavy-duty trucking vehicles. A lot of alignment. Sometimes it's sometimes it's you've got leaders, you've got laggards. We're always going to see that kind of cross section of what it takes to move quickly towards a goal. But knowing that there's this huge alignment between policy, government, and industry was a huge it's a huge advantage. But what we don't know is that second bullet over there on the left-hand side. What should we be doing in the utility industry, for example? What's the pace of needed action and investment, and where should we be investing to make sure that utilities can prepare charging sites and get power to those sites? And that has really never been clear. Obviously, it's a complicated landscape, as you guys well know. If you look at not just the investor-owned utilities, but now you add to it thousands and thousands of public power utilities and also the rural co-ops as well. So knowing that there is major alignment and there's a moment in time where we actually could align these voices together, but that we don't quite know what to do, we saw this as a moment where if we had extraordinary collaboration and partnering across the sectors that are kind of like required to make things happen, either they're mandated by vehicle efficiency targets or greenhouse gas goals, or it's the ambitions of shareholders in these companies, or it's simply just the ambition because we know there's so much at stake here for U.S. industry, as an example here across the manufacturing space. It'll take this extraordinary collaboration and partnering. We know that a lot of the processes that have been developed for getting power to load were designed with sort of buildings in mind over the last 100 years. And that's different than the challenges we're seeing with transportation. I'll go into a little bit of that as we go along. The other thing that just is apparent is that we don't have a lot of solutions out there or tools to bring together these major stakeholder groups like the manufacturers, the fleet operators, and the utility sector. They're diverse, they're large, and a lot of folks have a lot of trouble finding each other in this very complex landscape where you can't just pass one rule, one law, one policy, and it works. It isn't like that. This is going to be a much harder, more complex system. So it's not complicated, but it is complex. And finally, we do actually believe that some of this is going to land with a new kind of discussion based on data. I'm going to talk a lot about data today and the maps that we have coming out for the public good, for public consumption, public use. But landing in the regulator space is probably going to be important for the conversation.
How are you doing?
All right. If we can go to the next slide. This is the only slide I have for the entire
Hi.
program. I know we're all hearing a voice in the background that's not here. This is the slide of the program in its entirety. There are only titles in here, but just to give you a framework of what's going on here as we address EVs to scale 2030. It's about eradicating and addressing the barriers. First pillar, how big, how local, and when are the loads coming? If we were more certain, we'd all be able to act better based on better information. Two, the second pillar, the processes that were really never designed for transportation. And we've got mismatches in timing. The time it takes to procure a vehicle or the time it takes to procure a charging station. All that's a lot shorter timeline than the time it takes a utility today to get power to a site sometimes. Not all the time, but often. Third pillar, are there tools that we could design to make the system less complicated, drive simplicity, ease of finding each other, ease of understanding in with years of lead time, when and where loads are coming, not just with a service request 3 months before the trucks show up. So this is the sort of heart of the program, data-based. Can we convince each other with the voice of the folks that are actually electrifying, putting in charging stations, electrifying cars, electrifying truck fleets, and so on? Can we pull this information together so that everybody's more informed and we can prioritize our investments and our actions? It's, if you go to the next slide, and the next slide after that too, this is a very intentionally collaborative project. It's the next slide, please. It's not going to work unless fleet operators and manufacturers are talking with utilities so that utilities can talk back and discuss what is the nature of the electrification project that's happening. And can you tell me 5 years ahead of time where all your depots are for your trucking fleets? And when you intend to electrify fleets, is it 2 years, 8 years from now, 6 years? When are these fleets at that site electrifying? And so it has to be collaborative. So we imagined almost a year ago, maybe 10 months ago, that we had to have the complete spectrum of the utility industry represented in the project, not just investor-owned utilities and not just EPRI, but also working together with EEI, as an electric institute for the investor-owned utilities, NRECA with the rural co-ops, APPA with the municipal power companies, and so on. But also the auto and trucking industry, also fleet operators, also the charging providers, and also the standards organizations, because we've got some problems out there like reliability of charging infrastructure that also have to be addressed, or we can't get to scale either. Underlying everything, a really tight cord to the government so that we are working in lockstep and we're not surprising each other, and we can actually build on top of each other's efforts and not get put duplicative efforts in place. If we go to the next slide, I just want to give you a quick sense of who's on the board. You'll notice over there in our right-hand side, our esteemed commissioner here, Commissioner Peredick, is on the advisory board for the initiative. You'll also see Rachel Neeler over there in the sort of the gold color from the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. We thought really hard about what parties, what organizations need to know about what's happening here so they can steer it in the right direction, make sure we haven't missed a beat. Although we are a lot of utility experts, automotive experts, trucking experts, and fleet experts who have designed this program, having spent years in the pilot project phase, and now it's okay. Knowing what we know, how do we get to scale? You see a whole bunch of utilities in here. Maybe I'll just call your attention also to the other non-utilities. You see AAI, that's the Auto Alliance, essentially all of the light-duty vehicle manufacturers. That's the CEO, John Bozzella of the Auto Alliance. You've got Amazon, the voice of fleets on our board. Down below, you see Daimler Truck, the voice of trucking manufacturers, so that we make sure that we understand, in particular, their needs that are hyper-local. And, we've seen some very, very early test cases and test issues with electrifying the trucks. So we need to be particularly attentive to what they're already finding out. And I think with that, we can go on to the next slide too. So that's the board. These are the project partners. Who's funding this project right now? We've just started. We only did the public announcement of this project back in August. We wanted to make sure we had enough to talk about. We could sort of put in place some of the bones of the project, especially some of this data stuff that's coming out. I'm going to show you maps in just a second. But who's funding it? Amazon and a slew of utilities. There's a lot of interest in this program. I'm certain there will be a lot more added to this slide here too. But to be really honest, this has not been our priority as much as just getting action, trying to accomplish some of these, putting some of these tools and processes in place. So let's go to the next slide and let me start to explain again, one last time, what prevents all of us from just putting in enough charging stations and proactively building out the grid? It's always going to be a lack of confidence, right? We read the headlines. We know what GM, Ford, and Chrysler are saying. We know what Tesla's doing. We read the ambitions of the federal government. We know the ambitions. The question is what's really happening? Because if we really had confidence in what was happening, utilities would be ready to invest, and they'd know where to invest. Regulators, the same thing, with more confidence, knowing directly from the voice, not just of the utilities asking for some funding and permission to provide some, to capitalize certain projects. But if we knew directly from the voice of the Amazons and the UPSs, the FedExes and the Hertz rental cars and so on, if we knew exactly what they were doing, we'd all feel better, and we'd know that we were using ratepayer funds in the right way, a responsible, prioritized, no regrets way. And that's what EVs to Scale is about. At its core, it starts with data, and then using that data, we can solve an awful lot of other problems that I kind of got to on that 3-pillar slide before. But let's go ahead and try to get closer now to some of the data that's coming out. Again, only the first of many things that happens, but the core of almost everything. So it's just important for me to call attention to the number one thing over there. How are we doing these maps? What's different, right? We've always bought the data. You can buy off-the-shelf data from Geotab and NREX and Experian and Replica. You can buy all this data. It just isn't always that accurate. And there are gaps in the data. And sometimes you don't even know what the gap is. So it was important for us to get our arms around what data is out there and why is it never answering our questions at what we would suggest is a feeder level, something close enough to the utility where you actually can start to then calculate if it's on a feeder and we're projecting a 20 megawatt load or a 200 megawatt load, what are the kind of upgrades required on that feeder? So we started to look at Uber's new, yes, Uber developed a geospatial mapping architecture a couple years ago. Daimler Truck started using it. We saw what they did and said, oh my gosh, this is where we have to go at EPRI with our analysis. So we looked at the geospatial mapping architecture, and you can go down in layers, and every layer gets more and more granular. What we knew is that we had to find a sweet spot, a spot that was granular enough for utilities to be able to define actions and prioritize investments. So it kind of has to be at that feeder level. I apologize for the noise. I hope you don't hear that. But it could be street level, because this will make fleet operators and manufacturers very, very uncomfortable, and they will not be able to share information that has their competitive interests at risk. So we knew we had to go up from street level. Let's aggregate up to a more anonymized level, yet it's completely powerful for utilities, regulators, and ratepayer advocates as well to understand this. So the granularity is really important, that you're going to be seeing here in a couple maps. We did a layered approach so that everybody can contribute to our work. We don't have to own everything at EPRI. We can have the national labs working on certain layers of data, like military vehicles, non-tactical military vehicles. We can have WRI or EDF, who you're going to hear from in a second, talking and contributing to a layer of, for example, school bus data or answers about policy questions that we have based on the data. If we go to the next slide then, on that basis then, talking about the granularity and so on, it's important then to also see here who's involved. So again, just more analytics expert organizations. These are who we're working with just so far. We're just starting, knowing that there's an interest in folks contributing to the knowledge base that's going to come out of this new data. And then below the line, this is the really exciting part. We've already blended about 15 different sets of data. On the right-hand side, you can see the off-the-shelf data we purchased, Experian, Geotab, Replica. NREX is going to be right back on that. We're just renegotiating a contract with them. But the rest of the data is now coming into the program to fill gaps that we know exist in purchased data. And this is the voice that matters most, the voice of all of these other players. And this is the part of the slides where I've got about 12 entities listed, 12 data sources. This should go to 20, 40, 80, 200, 2,000. This is the richness of this project if we continue to view this as a very collaborative project. All right, I think I get to show you a map now. All right, These maps are going to be released publicly in about, I'm going to say 2 to 4 weeks. Please still don't hold it to me. We're working very closely. We're almost done with the complete quality assessment, quality analysis of the tool to make sure we've got it right. We're almost done with that. But what you will find online when these get released is an interactive map that starts out at a, what does that say down there? Hex 5 on the map in the bottom corner, where you can actually see the United States. Yes, we've got Alaska and we've got Hawaii too. You can see the United States at a Hex 5 level, which is 98 square miles. My eyes aren't so good, but I think it's 98 square miles in each one of the dots. If we went any less, you couldn't see any color on the map. But look at that call out box over there to the left, right? That's a Hex 8 map. That's that sweet spot. That's the spot where you can't see if it's Daimler trucks or Volvo trucks. You don't know if it's Amazon or if it's Walmart. But at a Hex 8 level, we're looking at essentially one feeder level. And we've had to do some very good calculations, vet them across the board with everybody we can talk to, experts in data analytics, experts in aggregation, disaggregation of data, our own experts internally, and so on. And what you see is the power of being able to zoom anywhere in the United States into your neighborhood, into the highway next door, into a utility service territory. You will be able to see across the United States, Hex 8 across the board. That is what we're trying to get to. This happens to show the light duty plus the medium duty, heavy duty in the 100% scenario where everything on the road is electric one day, so that we have a long-term planning horizon, but then we pull it in with the specifics of Amazon and FedEx and UPS and Enterprise and so on to lay out the specifics about what's happening in 2024, 25, 26, filled in with some simulation still, right? Nobody knows who's going to buy who in the retail market's going to buy the next EV. Automakers don't know, no one knows. So there you have to simulate based on past experience, trends, and so on. We've got some expertise in how to do that. We're working very closely with the national labs on that too. If we go to the next slide, and let me try to really move this along and speed this up. This is, I just want to give you a sense. This is my kludgy way of just taking 3 pictures of the maps that I've been vetting also internally. But this is what you'll be able to do with online with a very nice slider bar that just says, what does the load look like in 20, if I'm zoomed into a place, like this happens to be around the Ontario airport in Los Angeles, the big freight airport, where there are already known major loads coming. You can sort of move that slider bar from 2023, 24, 25, 27, 28, 29, 30, and then you'll hop over to a 100% scenario, which no one knows. Is that 2035 or 2085? We don't know that either. But to know what happens when all diesel trucks or cars are electrified is a hugely powerful, long horizon planning tool when you're looking more at the near term 23 to 29, 2030 frame. When do I have to act? Where is something more yellow, more red, more orange than the green, or green more than white? And so this is the power of the tool. This happens to be the light duty data. Next slide is the heavy duty, medium and heavy duty mapping as well, to show, again, a snapshot of 2023, 2030, which we've designed to be the policy compliant thing, all those alignments of mandates, requirements, ambitions. What does that look like in 2030, and how would we get there, and what do those loads look like if we achieve those goals? And then, of course, the 100% case for trucking. And I think if we just go to the next slide, this is just how I assure fleet operators, charging providers, fueling retailers that there is so much activity in a Hex 8 area. This is an example around that airport in Ontario and LA. One Hex. There's the map. If you go off and do a Google map search, and I just lay it side by side, there's the list on the right-hand side of all the companies operating in a single Hex 8 service area, single Hex 8 surface area. Look at it. It's Coca-Cola, it's Nabisco, and it's a bunch of other companies. So this is this, rest assured, your competitive interests are not violated. We're trying to take care. We respect the information we're getting. It's never been done. Let's work together to see what we can get done here. And if we go to the next slide then, so that's it on the maps. I think click through that one. Just keep clicking through it. One more click maybe. Yeah. It's a long way of saying, normally the conversations between fleet operators or anybody, building developer, start way down there where design goes into a service request. See that service request circle down there, the third circle over? That's where usually conversations start, and that's way too late for transportation. We have to move the conversation years in advance to accommodate utility lead times. We'll work on utility streamlining interconnect processes too, but there's no replacement for knowing years ahead of time where and when the loads are coming and pushing knowledge years in advance up to include when a station is just a vision, when a fleet is just a vision, but getting into the strategic planning of utility and getting it into the distribution and transmission planning for a utility. So a long way to say, this is the goal. Next slide. We're designing a tool that will basically formalize what we're doing now by knocking on doors of fleet operators and so on. We need a tool to do this, designed for the decades to come in the future, to take all the information from anybody who has transportation loads coming, charging infrastructure, for example, upload it into a secure online data exchange so that utilities can continue to check it regularly, see what's coming at them in an aggregated hex area, so conversations can start years ahead of time and not just the months ahead of time where we are today. So know that this tool is coming. This will formalize the process that we're doing very manually today. And then just regulatory. I only want to say a lot of what we're doing feeds what we imagine is a very, very critical part of this program too. Do we need to sort of relook at how we proactively, how we allow proactive build out of the grid? When are we confident enough? What does it mean to have feeder level data in the conversation? What does it mean to have Amazon and Daimler Truck standing there with their data backing up the need to start preparing the grid for this? If we go to the next slide, I think this is essentially my almost last slide. The key deliverable we imagine coming out of here is a 50-state outreach deck for each of the states that lays out state by state what matters for the state to understand here. What are the economic opportunities for each state, for the state of Alabama? What are the in-state revenue opportunities? Can we quantify it? Everyone's done these, we have some states that have done these analyses here and there. Can we just do this systematically for every state and determine what it means to electrify your state? What kind of industry support matters? If you're preparing a deck for Arkansas, we know the voice of Walmart matters. If we're preparing a deck for Washington State, it isn't just the utility voice that matters for the PUCs, it's also the voice of Amazon. What are you doing? Can your voice join the conversation so that we have a better picture of what's happening? But those lightning bolts in the middle there, what else goes into this? We want to really dig into the data on those maps and customize the takeaways for each state. Arkansas, Louisiana, Illinois, what do you need to know from this data? How many 50 megawatt expected loads or 20 megawatt feeder loads are coming in 2028 or 2029? What patterns do we see? What does this tell us about the supply chain, either nationally or statewide? So I maybe just suffice it to say, the idea is to take everything we're doing and put together usable reference materials and materials to help the conversation and show you where we should be looking in every state, where, when, and how big these loads are, so that we're prepared and have early notification of what's going on. And I think my very last slide this is the last one, just simply some of this material that I'm talking about, what we're learning in the project is on a website. We've got the website. We've got something else I didn't even talk about in column 2. Column 3 is a grid primer about what we're finding about capacity at the feeder level on the grid. It's a tricky, complicated subject. We're still working on taking not only load forecasts, which is what I've shown you today, but matching it to, well, what do we know about the grid and the feeders at that place on the grid? Because that's what really matters. Do we have 20 megawatts of capacity to serve the estimated 15 megawatts of load on that grid by 2028? That matters. It's a daunting task, and we're looking to see how we're going to make an attempt to make sure it's directionally accurate. It has to be directionally accurate, and so we're busy at work on that part of it. But there are materials there, so happy and looking forward to questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Britta. I really appreciate that. See, I told you all that Britta's a fantastic speaker and it would do a great job presenting all of this. I would love to dig into some more of that, but I think especially the last point that you made there about the feeder and grid capacity. You know, that's something that we at Utility Commission spent a lot of time thinking about and making sure that our utilities are properly planning for that. So I think that that's actually going to be one of the big topics that we'll talk about at the NARUC session, the electrification session on the Wednesday. So if you have questions that have come up, please feel free to put them in the chat for Britta in the meantime. But next, we're going to go to our next presentation, and Pamela, you'll have 15 minutes to talk about your perspective on medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification. So Pamela MacDougall, Dr. Pamela MacDougall, excuse me, is the Director of Grid Modernization Strategy at the Environmental Defense Fund. She's the national lead on grid modernization policies and regulations that both bolster the widespread use of clean energy technologies in medium and heavy duty transport and improve energy reliability through deployment of localized microgrid systems. She currently focuses on advancing the integration of medium and heavy duty zero emissions vehicles into the electric grid, which is cost effective for fleets, equitably to communities, and enables a transition of broader clean energy technologies. So Dr. MacDougall, over to you.
Thank you. And first off, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to EDF's perspective and some of our work that we've worked on, and also insights into some of our upcoming work that we're collaborating with EPRI on that I'm very excited about. The first portion of my presentation, I'm really going to focus on how do we attract and support medium and heavy vehicle electrification, and how do we pay for those system upgrades in a way that is beneficial to ratepayers. And then the second portion of my presentation, I'm actually going to be referencing EPRI's EV to scale quite a bit. I can't emphasize enough how monumental getting all of that information and how valuable it'll be. And so I'll be listing a number of ways that you can be leveraging that data to incorporate in utility planning and get ahead of this like big challenge of electrification that's coming, that I think is really exciting. One thing that we're noticing in EDF's advocacy, as well as our collaboration with industry partners like Amazon and other types of fleets, is that they are going to be requiring a significant amount of investments on the fleet side. This is both for the make-ready costs, but also in the utility side, the distribution grid upgrades to support that. What's unique about medium and heavy-duty vehicles, which I'm not sure was fully appreciated on Britta's maps, but I'm sure if you zoom in on the hex, is the stark difference between light-duty and medium and heavy-duty vehicle electrification, where you're having a significant amount of power coming on at once, needing to be supporting these fleets, and in really targeted location-specific areas, which is very different from light-duty passenger vehicles, where they're spread pretty evenly or across the utility territory. But for fleets, we're seeing 10 to 30 megawatts coming on one feeder location in some areas, and that can be terrifying and a huge challenge for utilities to get ahead of time. So yeah, we actually procured a study to assess the cost investment to support fleet electrification and distribution grid costs. This study was done by Synapse, and we wanted to look at two utility service territories. One was Con Edison and the other was National Grid, both in New York. We chose these specifically because obviously Con Edison is a very urban utility, a matrix grid, so it has very different costs, but also has a lot of like high utilization and its own challenges. And then National Grid that has a lot more urban areas, rural areas. So it is very different when you're looking at utilization and like paying for the grid. And we analyzed the cost of distribution system upgrades, as well as covering customer and utility side make ready for medium heavy vehicle sales by 2045. So to support ACT, Advanced Clean Trans Truck, in New York. We also assessed the expected revenue from this load. Recognizing that protecting ratepayer aspects and maximizing the grid, we also looked at modest managed charging to help improve revenues by reducing grid expansion costs. The reason that we were looking at both distribution system upgrades, but also make ready, is make-ready costs are about 30% of the TCO for charging infrastructure for fleets. And what we're hearing, in particular from a lot of small fleets, is that cost is actually killing their business model for them to be able to transition to electric. So we investigated a way that we could support fleets and attract fleets to electrify, because the Amazons of the world are only going to utility territories that have programs like this, but also enabled and did not drive up rates. So next slide, I'm going to show you the first results of this study. So this first slide looks at unmanaged charging, and every year through that for both Con Edison and NetGrid. And by unmanaged charging, I'm sure you're aware, it's when the truck comes back, plugs in, goes full power, to be able to maximize, get charged as quickly as possible. And here, what we're seeing in both territories is there was a net positive. And by that, I mean that the cost needed to invest in distribution system upgrades and make-ready infrastructure was far less than the revenues. There were significant revenues in Con Edison, and it probably leveled out in National Grid, about zero or even. The revenues weren't that much higher than the cost, but it was still positive for unmanaged charging. And that is a really big win for supporting fleet electrification, but also for paying for the grid itself to support ACT. Next slide. And the next thing is like, well, we noticed that the National Grid revenues weren't as high as we would have expected, but obviously there is a more rural, less utilization. So we looked at modest managed charging and how that would impact revenues, but also make it more advantageous and minimize risk for ratepayers if you're going to be investing in distribution system upgrades and make-ready infrastructure. And again, we still see Con Edison has high revenues, about 700 million, whereas National Grid now finally has more positive net revenues with about 90 million. I would note that the managed charging was extremely modest, and we chose that strategically. It was very conservative that we only added about, on average, 2 hours of charging for the entire profile. And what we're seeing with a lot of fleets is they're able to actually spread overnight for about 6 to 8 hours, depending on their use case. So we would anticipate there being even more positive results if you had very good managed charging programs, such as time of use rates or things like that, to support maximizing the grid. Next slide. So I kind of what I'm going to do, this is how you pay for the grid and how you can support fleets, is by covering make-ready costs, customer and utility side. It's very beneficial for the fleets, but also that the investments, the revenues will outweigh the cost to meet ACT. So it shouldn't be a fear for commissioners to start investing in the grid to get there. Now, there is some risk, obviously, because as Britta mentioned, we can't wait until the fleet shows up ready for design and implementation, they have the chargers ordered, to be able to start building out the grid. There's 30 megawatts coming on one location, and the utilities timelines for building is not 3 to 4 months. It can be, in some instances, 5 to 7 years. And that's why it's so valuable to look at data like what Britta and EPRI has been providing. First slide. So as I mentioned, we're seeing significant load, uneven distribution. And some things that we're seeing is we need to look at more long-term forecasts of planning and updating our planning efforts. And the other thing that we can be looking at, and I'll mention in the end, is some short-term mitigating solutions to kind of get ahead. We're already a little bit too late in some ACT states for getting interconnection in time, and what you can start exploring to be able to get these chargers online while you're implementing and utilizing EPRI's EV to scale to update your grid planning. Next slide. One thing that we've been really advocating for and working with a number of utilities, in particular for electric trucks, is looking at bottom-up forecasting. A lot of the load forecasting methods are really top-down, spreading the load evenly across the distribution grid. But as I mentioned, there's core hubs, there's core areas. We know where the depots are, but it's very specific and different from light-duty and traditional load. And so utilizing existing data to be able to, one, identify where these areas are, but also to outreach directly to fleets to understand where and when they're going to be electrifying. And something that we can kind of reference as a good example, and I know that they have worked with the telematic data with OEMs, and they're also collaborating with EPRI, but they have a whole team to directly outreach with fleets, is they've done some mapping, fleet mapping, and identified where and when they're coming online using depot locations, the telematic data, and EPRI, and then reached out to those customers to try to understand and plan where and when they're going to be electrifying, so that they understand if they need to do a substation upgrade or they need to do like a line extension and get ready for that. And that helps them plan both supply, because we are seeing a lot of hardware challenges across the nation, and we want to get ahead of that, but also labor, so that they have sufficient staff on board to be able to support this rapid electrification, rapid need that's coming online. Next slide. And there's other things that you should be considering besides bottom-up forecasting. One thing that we're seeing is looking at working with your sister agencies and looking at multiple territories. California has their freight infrastructure plan, where they're working with all of their sister agencies to identify where and when is very key to invest, where there's support programs, and where they plan on having the fleets come online and prioritized. I also think in particular, and I don't need to speak to any of you about this, is when you are doing grid expansion and grid planning, siloing the work to just medium and heavy vehicles probably isn't wise. And you need to have a holistic plan for all types of decarbonization that's happening. Renewables deployment, we have the IRA and the IIJA, which is injecting a lot of funds into clean energy technologies. So looking at how the entire grid is going to be changing and can be adapting to uptake these new technologies is going to be really important. And that's something, for example, in New Jersey, we've seen already with their energy master plan and their grid modernization proceeding. And then finally, looking at longer time horizons and adjusting the time horizon. Something that I've been really excited to see is the coordinated grid planning process in New York. And this is creating an opportunity for utilities and grid upgrades to happen outside general rate cases, to get ahead of what's needed and identify core areas that need to have grid upgrades. I highly recommend looking into that and working with Jen Robertson on understanding that. But this kind of process where it brings on a steering committee and really works with all agencies to understand what and where we need to meet our state targets is going to be really important. Next slide. And so other things, and I probably mentioned this to a lot of my colleagues that are on this call, is how do we get ahead of this load? And it's something that Britta has kind of inferred in her presentation. Building to need and not reacting to load requests. Just the sheer magnitude of energy that we're going to need and grid capacity we're going to need in certain areas means that we are seeing already interconnection delays of 5 to 7 years and even longer in some territories. And we need to get ahead of that. And good data is really important for that. We've seen some efforts where utilities are starting to plan around fleet clusters, like the Duke Energy rate case did have some really positive stuff about identifying these key zones. Sister agencies and directives such as AB 2700, which I think EPRI's EV2 scale does a better job, but I don't want to choose favorites here, really calls on a sister agency to collect that fleet information, understand when and where they're going to be planning to include in utility planning processes. And then after that in California, we also just had SB 410 approved, which directs utilities to plan for fleet electrification building and transportation electrification, and see where there is going to be hotspots, report interconnection delays, which I think is really important for transparency to understand the problem as it happens. But also, as I mentioned, prepare for supply chain issues as well as labor constraints. And then finally, shout out to the medium heavy duty planning proceeding that is happening in New York that really addresses truck electrification and the challenge that is going to be faced in New York. So really looking at building in advance instead of waiting for a load request. And I recognize that that is a really challenging issue because you want to protect ratepayers. You don't want to gold plate the grid. It's something that I'm very fearful of, but recognizing that this load is coming, it's a matter of understanding where and when it's happening and getting ahead of that. And so I am going to cite that I do have a number of studies coming out next year. One I've been working very closely with EPRI, which is really going to assess the cost and potential benefit for proactively building. versus sequential grid upgrades, so business as usual, and also some mitigating solutions to mitigate risk. The other one is a best practices document that we've developed with a broad stakeholder of people, many of which are on Britta Gross's steering board, that will give best practices and ways that you can proactively develop the grid without impacting ratepayers, but also getting ahead of this load cycle and enabling us to meet our broader net zero transition goals. So throwing that it'll be out probably in January, both studies and reports, and excited to share that with you at that point as well. And happy to give more details at a later time about both of those studies. Next slide. So I talked about short-term solutions, recognizing that we are a little late in some areas. We are seeing interconnection delays, and we want to energize these as fast as possible. And this is where we need to kind of meet the fleets where they're at. Something that I've been a really big proponent on is non-wires alternatives, looking at using behind-the-meter solar and storage and managed charging programs to be able to maximize existing grid assets, multiple levels of the grid, but also to be able to energize quicker. And so connecting at a lower level, but having larger capacity behind the meter. And that kind of brings me to flexible interconnections. That is something that was inferred in FERC Order 2023, and I'm hoping that it is something that becomes best practices across the US. A lot of these fleets are already installing storage. A lot of them are already installing solar as a way to mitigate demand charges. And that's a great thing. We want them to be able to have more controllable load. We want them to have more assets behind the meter for resiliency and reliability, but also to help with our other clean energy targets. But allowing them to flexibly interconnect allows them to maximize the cost on the make-ready side, but also to get them online quicker if you're allowing them to interconnect at their net load instead of their full capacity. And I'm happy to have a broader discussion about how that could be implemented and how it is already being implemented in Europe where I'm based, but can be explored in the US. And then finally, to address some of the labor constraints is to look at third-party construction. I know a lot of utilities are already exploring that, seeing how we can enable standards and best practices to allow for third-party companies to come in to build out the grid so that we can meet our timelines and targets. Next slide. And yeah, in summary, new data sources are great for forecasting. Reach out to Britta for EVs to scale. Happy to talk about other data sources as well that are available to you to include in grid planning processes, such as depot data, telematics from the OEMs, as well as looking at heat maps for emissions, as well as are really good to be able to identify where these fleets are, update your planning processes to better reflect the reality of what's happening for truck electrification. And there's a lot of short-term solutions out there that you can explore to get them online while you're coming up with a bigger plan for building to need. Next slide. I think we're good. I think I'm on schedule as well, which is great.
Thank you, Dr. MacDougall. I think the line that you said about we trying to understand where and when the load is coming, that really gets to the heart of many of our concerns on this the state working group. It's a lot of what we're attempting to understand. So hopefully we'll be able to get into that a little bit more during the Q&A and during the closed session at the end. But prior to that, we have our final presentation for the day. We have Jacqueline Piero, who's the U.S. head of policy and regulatory at the Mobility Project. Jacqueline has worked for more than a decade reframing electric vehicles as distributed energy resources in regulatory and market spaces, primarily focusing on regulatory development around bidirectional vehicle-to-grid resource. This year, she joined the Mobility House to help streamline use of EV automated load management technologies in the U.S. to mitigate the need for infrastructure upgrades as EV market shares increase. Jacqueline, over to you.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm with the, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm with the Mobility House actually.
Sorry.
No problem, no problem. Yeah, from the Mobility House, and we are a 14-year-old company in Europe. We are a 4-year-old company in the United States. So next slide, please. I do just want to quickly talk about what this company does, and it's related to what Pamela was talking about. Because we started in Europe, we work much more with load management, with flexible connections, with figuring out how to cram more electric vehicles in a parking lot than the electrical connection should be able to serve. We've done that with 1,200 plus fleets, and before you say that's not that much, that's over 160,000 chargers. So we have a lot of experience figuring out how to coordinate fleets in a way that makes sense for the grid. Next slide, please. And so I am here to talk about that short term, or I would more say near term in any given situation where we don't have the luxury of advanced planning, where advanced planning hasn't been able to be put in place yet. And so I'm here to talk about automated load management, what it is, how it works. I'm going to use my company as an example, but it's just meant to show how mature this technology is, how sophisticated it is, and there are many other companies that are doing this. I just happen to be the one that's coming to talk to you. But what this technology does is allow electric vehicles to have, or electric vehicle supply equipment to be coordinated in a fleet setting in particular, in a way that keeps the aggregate usage at that site at any given time below a set limit. It's like avoiding a demand charge, but the stakes are much higher because you're making sure that you don't exceed your panel capacity. The sophistication comes in on the right when you see that we're not just dividing the panel capacity by the number of EVSEs we have and giving each EVSE the same amount of power. We're leaving the EVSE's full nameplate capacity available to it at any given time, so that the optimization comes from smart coordination of the fleet itself. Next slide, please. A few examples of how this manifests. Probably the most relevant one is in New York. We were working with the utility where we proposed to just avoid a panel upgrade, and they explained to us that our panel may not need an upgrade, but they didn't have room on the utility side. The transformer was going to need upgraded. And so they instead gave us a limit based on the transformer's capacity, and we were able to do a two-phased electrification plan for a school bus fleet. So rather than having 4 buses be able to charge, which is what we would have been able to do with 80 kilowatts of nameplate, we were able to have 15 buses charge with no need to change or no impact on the mobility needs of the fleet, the mobility ability of the fleet. The fleet's not noticing this. When the utility has finished upgrading the transformer, we can go ahead and do phase 2 of that school's electrification journey. And that is one of the most important impacts of having access to this type of technology. It can allow a utility to reinsert planning into what may feel like a relatively chaotic electrification process right now. Next slide, please. How does this work? What do we do? This is an actual screenshot of an operating load management optimization at a site in Ireland. What I'm showing you on the left is 12 different EVSEs operating independently of each other in order to fulfill the needs of the EV that is pulling up to them with a scheduled time to leave. You can see that on the y-axis, there's 7 kilowatts. Each EVSE has 7.36 kilowatts in this scenario, but it scales. You can see that in the first couple hours, all the EVSEs are charging at a low but consistent rate. And then a few hours in, someone pressed a prioritization button that meant that a single EVSE needed to charge very quickly. All the other EVSEs that could dropped off to allow that to happen. And once that EV had gotten its charge, the other ones start to come back up. It happens again, and all the EVSEs that can drop off. On the right, what I'm showing is the aggregate usage at the site this site had 28.9 kilowatts, even though we had almost 90 kilowatts of nameplate EVSE operating at that site. We're not just prioritizing the individual mobility needs as shown on the left, we're also prioritizing the site panel, the electrical integrity of the site on the right. And so what you can see is in those first few hours, all the EVSEs are stacked up to almost exactly 29 kilowatts because we don't have to leave 25% in Ireland. And then at 2200, when one EVSE, when you see that purple blob appear in the middle and one EVSE needs to take more, you can see all the other EVSEs dropping away. So we stay beneath that 29 kilowatts. And that is the essence of an automated fleet management system. It's prioritizing both the site itself and that limit, while prioritizing also each EV's mobility needs. Again, this is just an example of how we do it, but other companies do this. You can do this with a single EV. We see this in France. Residential connections are built like this. So you have your EVSE plugged directly into the smart meter, and it's doing this exact optimization. Next slide, please. As both of the previous speakers have been talking about, we do have some idea where we're going to see load coming on. This is from a really great ICCT report that came out earlier this year. And what they're saying with this map is that medium and heavy duty EVs will not be the bulk of the vehicles, but they will have the biggest impact on the grid overall. And we can see, based partly on advanced clean trucks rule states, but also on industrial counties, industrial cities, cities with ports, cities with major distribution hubs, where this load is going to come on. But that's for commercial fleets. When we talk about transit, when we talk about school buses, those are federally funded. And not to minimize the effort, but all you need is an administrator with a can-do attitude in Adobe Acrobat, and you can have a multi-megawatt request for capacity pop up in an area with no history of electrification. And utilities that are in those areas may be able to absorb that, or they may not. And as Pamela was saying, I think it used to be if you had a multi-megawatt request coming in, it was because it was a Walmart or a factory, and you had multiple years for the utility to deal with that request. When you have a month's time frame for the EVSE installation, the utility needs to be able to get away from the yes or no binary of their response and be able to go to more of a yes if response. Next slide, please. And this is, I believe this one is from an E3 report, but we saw a very similar thing going on in the Synapse report that was referenced earlier, where we can see that the difference between EV connected load and EV coincident load is huge. And when we say EV coincident load, this is what I'm hearing utilities concentrate on all the time. And what that means is, when are EVs charging at the same time that their local infrastructure, their feeder, their transformer, their substation is experiencing its peak? And it's not that often, but you can still move the EV charging away from that peak. And what we have had utilities tell us is, if we can model a fleet, if someone can model a fleet and guarantee that the 20 hours a year that their charging would exceed the capacity of their local feeder or their local transformer, if we can stop charging during those 20 hours, we've given the utility some breathing room. They're still going to do that upgrade. But electrification doesn't have to cease while they do that upgrade. We can have that agreement that allows the site to electrify. And it may be a temporary agreement. After that upgrade happens, the site can have its full capacity. But across the country, what we're hearing is what Pamela said. flexible connections, flexible connections, flexible connections. And utilities are telling us that they are looking for forward-looking planning methods, exactly what's been discussed before me, but they want to combine it with this increased malleability of their definition of load, of how they look at the need to build. And again, we're going to have to build. We're going to have to build more than we did since the first time we built the grid. But we do need to help utilities have the tools to make it as orderly as possible, even in the short term. I don't know if I have any more slides. Next slide, please. There may be one backup slide, actually. Look again. This is the difference between what I'm talking about, where we may just be avoiding a panel upgrade at our site, and where utilities are talking about flexible connections and dynamic hosting capacity. And it's the difference between a panel upgrade and a transformer upgrade. It's the difference between us just managing load like we're avoiding a demand charge, and us getting input from the utility about when they need to shed some load at our site. It's very similar to a traditional demand response program in that respect, but it also has a lot in common with non-wires alternatives. And the amount of interest that we've gotten from utilities on this right side tells me that it is worth talking to your utilities to understand if they need regulatory development to open this option to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Yeah, appreciate that presentation. I thought it was really interesting to see that automated fleet management graphs that you showed, showing a real world example of how this works. I think having that visual is really valuable. So appreciate that, and the all of the context around this as well. So now we have some time for questions from the audience for all three of our panelists today. Feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask one out loud. And then I also see that we have one in the chat, which I'll read to get us kicked off. From the chat, it says, to what extent should medium and heavy duty electrification, especially in utility-owned charging facilities and or system upgrades, be paid for through revenues collected through charging rates paid for by EV owners versus the general rate base from all customers? And I think it'd actually be interesting to hear the perspective maybe from all three of our panelists on that, because that's that really gets to the heart of a lot of what we think about on public utility commissions. So Britta, maybe do you want to start with you?
I'm not sure I should comment a lot on policy from EPRI, but I mean, maybe I'll just add one nuanced perspective on this idea of, where do benefits accrue? And I've long thought, as I watched light duty vehicle sector grow in electrification, that if you're trying to make a business case out of a standalone DC fast charger, it's almost impossible to do that. If you think about where the benefit accrues in total, then you start to understand that overnight charging or managed charging, like Jacqueline's talking about, if we can shape where the charging occurs, everyone's going to benefit from this. So I always want to make the problem just a little bit bigger before we sort of address a very specific issue of who should be paying that make-ready cost for that fleet who has a lot of deep pocket. So I think we really should start looking at this as sort of a big total system, because transportation and energy, they're going to have to come together. We have to fix this and make this a good system design.
I don't think I'm going to disagree with a lot of what Britta said. I'll first start with like utility ownership and revenues from that, where I think that revenues from all utility ownership of charging, if we do permit that, which EDF doesn't have a strong support for utility owned charging unless it's in disadvantaged communities or areas with which are necessary for deployment and access, should go broader into paying. But I also agree with Britta, like identifying who is in charge or attributed to an upstream grid upgrade and the broader benefits both on resiliency, reliability, meeting or other net zero targets is really difficult. And there's other benefits, societal benefits to electrifying as well for end customers. So I am a very big supporter, and our study also showed that when you do spread it across the rate base, it does drive down rates if implemented in an managed charging way and implementing some of those flexible interconnection solutions that Jackie referenced as well.
I don't have much to add. Well said from both of you, but to foot stamp it, I think everyone understands that proactive distribution build out is advisable and necessary. But figuring out how to assure the public that that's being done in a responsible way, particularly if we're going to rate base those things, is something that bears quite a bit of thought as we're constructing these programs.
I think not only assuring the public that it's done in a responsible way, but making sure that we believe that it's done in a responsible way to be able to make that decision. And I think that's where this more data is needed, and where we, as the decision makers at the commissions, are going to need to really understand how this all fits together in a really comprehensive way to be able to be confident to make decisions like that. Yeah, appreciate those thoughts. Any other questions or comments from participants before we go to the closed section?
Commissioner Paratek, I have a comment.
Please.
And then first I'll introduce myself. My name is Ryan Cheney, and I'm in a fellowship with the Department of Energy, but I day-to-day work for the North Carolina Utilities Commission. And I come from the utility industry. I worked for PG&E for a decade. I was a wind developer. I was in the finance organization. I was in the customer organization during a lot of the PSPS, public safety power shutoff work. So I'm familiar in a lot of ways with the utility world. The electric transportation space is newer to me, and I'm getting to work on it with the North Carolina Utilities Commission. And I love this working group. And these three presentations are incredibly useful to me. I take them, I think about them, I go back to the commission and educate. I don't have a question at the moment, but I don't want you all to think that that's not because they're not incredibly useful. They are. And I just wanted to say that.
That's great. Thanks, Ryan.
Can I add one thing that I should have said during my presentation?
Of course.
These flexible connections that Pamela brought up and that I was talking about, she mentioned that they're very common in Europe, and it is true. In the UK, if you want to sell an EVSE, it is table stakes that you have a system like this. If your EVSE doesn't have these capabilities and your charge management system does not, the customer will ask you why. The utilities use these connections as a standard part of their energization procedure. And I wanted to foot stamp this because I understand the need to have some assurance that this can work. And there are other utilities. There's a utility association in the UK that I'm sure would be happy to interact with this group and talk about how they figured these things out as they sort of ran ahead with electrification of various things. But we don't need to reinvent this wheel.
So where do you think the disconnect is there then? Sorry, Eric, I'll get to you right after this. I just want to follow up on what Jacqueline just said. Where do you think the disconnect is there then between why this is being not only utilized, but thought of as a fundamental part of decision-making in Europe and not as much here? I
think in the UK in particular, they act kind of as the test lab for the world when it comes to impacts of distributed resources on the grid, because they are a very small grid. They don't have lots of DC connections with other systems. So as they got a lot of solar, as they increased their EV penetration, they've confronted various issues that were still theoretical in other areas, like loss of grid inertia, voltage spikes, that sort of thing, and extreme constraints on their grids. But I would also just say that I think Europe started electrifying before the United States did. And so the introduction of these technologies, the identification of these issues is lagging here, probably to the same extent it lagged there. They just experienced it first. But I don't know if any of my colleagues have anything else to say.
I mean, I can comment a little bit just because I've lived here for now 12 years. And there's a couple of avenues, I guess, distinctions between the US versus, and I'm broadening Europe because every single country and utility is very different. And that's the same in the US. As Jackie mentioned, a little further along electrification, what's very unique, in particular where I'm at in Amsterdam and some of these older cities, is the permitting to build out is a lot longer. If you're going to rip up a cobble street, it's going to take a lot longer to get approval for that. And so they're faced with a lot of mandates for interconnection and serving the load, because they're also expanding their cities quite quickly. And that's where they're looking at non-wires alternatives as well to be able to get it online. The other thing that we're seeing is there's a lot of pressure legislatively for the utilities to meet this demand. And so we're seeing new innovative like guarantees coming on, like ramped connections. And I'm happy to share some of the language in the UK that they've explored with net zero to be able to guarantee the customer that the capacity will be available when they're expanding their deployment. The other thing that is very different, obviously, is the unbundling. And so they're actually, and the rapid deployment of distributed energy resources, their wholesale markets are flooded with DERs and aggregator services for a really long time. And so there is already precedent for them to be leveraging these behind the meter assets for broader grid services at the distribution as well as at the transmission system-wide level.
Yeah, thanks for that. Eric?
Thank you. This question is for Pamela. When you were presenting the revenue and then the costs for the medium heavy duty chargers, I want to clarify two things. If I understood the context of that, those costs included the utility covering the make ready. And then the other thing I want to clarify is if the revenue assumed the existence of demand charges.
Yes to both. So we use the existing rates that were implemented or unavailable in both utility territories. That include both demand charges. There's no demand holidays there. And also we allowed the utility or explore the utility covering utility side make ready as well as customer side make ready costs, because that is a very big burden for fleets, in particular small fleets, to electrify. And still the revenue by far outweighed the cost.
Thank you.
And we'll go to Michael next, but there's a request to jump to the revenue slides to go back to those quickly. There's another question in a similar vein,
Sure.
Presumably from Dr. MacDougall's presentation.
Yes. And I see Michael has his hand up, but if you don't mind, I had a very similar
Oh, no,
question
go
to
ahead.
Eric.
Okay. Yes, that's fine. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, oh, there it is. I guess what methods were used in these to project revenues from, I guess that would be the revenues associated with the charging rates, or would it be the revenues from the general rate base?
Would it be from the charges, from the load that came on as attributed to the vehicles?
Okay.
And I can share the actual study with all the assumptions in the chat so that you can go through that as well. That probably is more helpful. I realize I didn't link it on my presentations.
Oh, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
I guess what we're grappling with in Hawaii, as we have a proposal for a utility-owned charging infrastructure before us right now, is, it touches on my earlier question about to what extent should this new infrastructure, especially utility-owned charging stations, be paid for by the through the rate design and the charging rates that are borne by actual EV owners versus the general rate base. And so when I see net revenues here, I guess, is it more in reference to revenues associated with non-utility charging, non-utility owned charging infrastructure?
Yeah, as I mentioned, EDF has a pretty strong stance on utility ownership of charging unless it's in disadvantaged communities or areas where you're not going to have private investment. So this study focused on medium and heavy duty vehicles only and not light duty. I'll start with that. The charging needed to attribute that, and it's the revenues only from those chargers for medium and heavy duty vehicles.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that study would be really helpful to see.
I'll put it in the chat right now.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. And I think we'll do our last question before we go to the closed section. Michael?
Yeah, I'm Michael Kintnermeyer. I'm advising the DOE on vehicle grid integration questions. And my question targets the proactive utility investments in upstream infrastructure. To what degree do we have some metrics or some understanding of making decisions from the regulatory side to deem this as prudent, fair, and responsible versus, gold-plated? So do we have some way to judge this that is sort of uniform, and that the Department of Energy might be able to develop tools to reveal this metric, or to reveal what good and responsible proactive investments are?
I think I'll answer with a non-answer, but absolutely with the fact that this is something that we are actually actively investigating, leveraging the EVs to scale data to understand the cost and revenue of proactively developing, identifying what the boundaries are for identifying hotspots and when you should pre-invest and when you shouldn't, and some of the boundaries with which you should permit it. Happy to coordinate with DOE further, though, on thinking about tools, but for me, I would love to have a broader conversation about how we can leverage the existing insights that you have to be able to create something to do that with EVs to scale and some of our other thought leadership with ratepayer advocates and industry parties.
Absolutely. Just drop me an email, and I'll send you an email and we start the conversation.
Super, really excited. Thank you.
Yeah, that's certainly an important question. Okay, well, thanks so much to all of our presenters for the session. Really appreciated you coming and sharing all of this information with us.